Folsom, California, a town of promise, potential, and some conflict. But who lived here in 1860? I set out to find out the demographics of the population of Granite Township and Folsom in a census review. Folsom, California in 1860 was so dynamic, so much potential and promise, and as we will see, some conflict. But Folsom, which was in the Granite Township in 1860, had a lot going on. First, there were the railroads. The Sacramento Valley Railroad came in 1856. The California Central Railroad had built a huge trestle bridge across the American River, and that train was headed to Marysville. There was the Sacramento Placer Nevada Railroad that was in the planning stages that would go from right across the river at Ashland up to Auburn. So there was a lot of transportation projects happening and becoming, just a real hub of activity for miners and people traveling throughout the state. Of course, Folsom had a nice grid town layout, and people were buying lots there for a home. And the community was also coming together, and they had started raising money to open up what they called the Folsom Literary Institute, which was going to be a preparatory school, similar to what many men experienced on the East Coast. Importantly, for the town of Folsom and thriving was water. And the Natoma Water and Mining Company had a series of water ditches that went through the town, down to the river, south of the town several miles, primarily for mining. But without water, it was there for the new residents and businesses and the trains. So that was a real huge foundation upon which to build a larger community, and that attracted people. Now, Folsom was in Granite Township, and I wanted to know what were the demographics of Folsom and this area. But when you look at the census pages from 1860, it's very difficult to know where someone lived, whether it was in Folsom or outside. So I had to look at Granite Township, which was formed in 1856 by Sacramento County, primarily, I think, because of the railroad. Now, townships were small administrative units within the county. They elected a constable and a justice of the peace to take care of, local minor law and order issues. And of course, the townships were involved in elections and whatnot. But of course, they were also a unit for the census. So when I went to the census for 1860, Sacramento County, Granite Township, and it was comprised of 50 pages. It noted 552 dwellings within those 50 pages where people lived. Sometimes there was multiple families in one dwelling. And there were 1,956 residents. Now, on this particular sample page, you can see B.N. Bugbee, Benjamin Norton Bugbee. He was the first elected constable of Granite Township and would go on to be Sacramento County Sheriff. Let's look at the population, that 1,956 people spread out over approximately 27 square miles, but the concentration really around the town of Folsom. The residents, 1,003, were born in the United States, about 51%. 31% were of European birth, from those different countries: Germany, Ireland, England, France, Prussia. The Chinese, 286 individuals, almost 15% of the population, and then some folks from North America, Canada, and Mexico sprinkled in there as well. So it was very diverse, a lot of different languages being spoke, different dialects, cultures, religions. It was quite a mixed, diverse community. If we go down a little bit further and look at the people by state, we see that there was a lot of people from the East Coast, specifically the Northeast. 360 people, about 36%, and that's New York, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts. So a lot of people from that region. The Midwest, Minnesota, Ohio, Iowa, comprised 275. The southern states, there were about 156 people, and they were almost 16% of the population that were born in the United States. Then we have the western US, 209. 205 of those were Californians, born in California. So if you were born in California, you had to be, under 12 or under 10 years of age. So those were children for the most part, because people were coming and having families. Now, if we look at the township by gender, no surprise, 77% were men. When you get down and you look at individuals under 16 years of age, it's more evenly split, almost 50-50. But obviously a large number of men in the mining sector, because it was difficult to come over out to California. So now I was looking at occupations, and of the 1,956 residents in the township, 1,347 or 68%, 69% actually listed an occupation. So a lot of people didn't list an occupation, but if you were a child, you didn't have an occupation. And many women did not list an occupation. The number one occupation listed was miner, 665 individuals. Almost 50% of the population was engaged in the mining industry. Another 100 they consider themselves laborers, which kind of makes sense. People were building homes, there was railroad depots, there was constructions on the railroad. So it was fairly easy to pick up work in the area as a day laborer. We had a growing agricultural sector, 68 farmers, and of course there was the merchant class of 63. I was kind of surprised at the high number of blacksmiths, 35, but then I thought about it and I go, well, the railroad, and you need blacksmiths to fix broken parts, metal parts. Saloon management, bartenders, saloon keepers, 29. So you can see there was a diverse crowd, but a community of all these different occupations going to make up, a community that was working. Other occupations that were also important to Folsom, there were carpenters and butchers, wood choppers, which I found interesting, but of course wood was the primary source of energy for heating and cooking, because there wasn't an available source of coal. So wood was very important. Of course, the trains ran on wood to build the steam. So a variety of different occupations within the town. There were some brick makers, not a lot of people associated with the railroad, but they may have lived in Sacramento. Then I wanted to break down the miners by the region where they came from. And it was interesting that 208 of those who listed their occupation as a miner were born in the United States. A large sector of Europeans, 37%. Some other North Americans in there. And the Chinese, 191 of the Chinese listed their occupation as miner. And that was almost 29% of the mining population. So it was big. Breaking down the European miners, huge from Ireland, 119 men from Ireland engaged in the mining community. What I find interesting about how they listed their origin of birth is the identity. So France, 32 men listed that they were born in France. But you go down and there's 13 listed that they were born in Fayou, which is a little region of France. And they could have said they were from France, but they had a strong identity with that particular spot in France. Just like the Western Islands. 24 listed Western Islands, and that's right off of Scotland, and I guess probably it was considered Scotland. There was that identity of being from the Western Islands. When it came to race in the census records, they didn't do a real good job. There was essentially only 3 colors. You had Mongolian or Chinese, black, and everyone else was white. There was no rainbow in there of different ethnicities and races. But we do know that within those who were listed as white, they may not have been European white. But 10% were listed as Asian, Chinese. I was somewhat surprised. Folsom originally was called Negro Bar for the black miner population, but in 1860, only 14 individuals identified as black. And those 14 individuals, most of them were clustered in a particular area. You don't know where because the census page doesn't tell you, possibly in the Negro Bar area. They all kind of lived together, but there were some others scattered throughout the township, and they had a variety of occupations, and they were from different states back east. One from the Sandwich Islands, England, and then we also had Canada in there and the West Indies. But a small black population in and around Folsom in 1860. Then I wanted to focus on the Chinese. Now, the Chinese population by gender, no surprise, 92, almost 93% of the individuals were men. Very small portion were women. Some of the women listed an occupation as seamstress or laundress, washerwoman, but most of them did not list an occupation. I did come across one Chinese child, at least if the age is correct, 3. That would have been the only Chinese child in the Granite Township in 1860. I'm inferring that the woman above Wan Ho, Ma Ho, would have been the mother. But otherwise, there were no Chinese children in the area. In terms of occupations, most of the Chinese were miners, 191 of them. And then there was the merchant class. Traders, I don't really understand, or I don't completely know what a trader was, either from the Chinese perspective or the U.S. perspective. I'm not really sure how those people made their money, but that's what they listed themselves, their occupation as. And then you had cooks, carpenters, laundry. So even though some of those merchants served, the white population, they were also catering to the Chinese population. And there were people, gardeners, working in the farming industry because there was water, so you could grow some crops. Now, there was some Chinese wealth accumulation, but when it comes to the valuation of real estate and property, it was very, very subjective. It's hard to translate what $500 in property meant then and what it could be today. Oftentimes blacksmiths and barbers, they would list property, but those were most likely the tools that they had with them. A butcher had certain knives and whatnot that was property and valuable. They could sell those. But many Chinese, 27 of them, reported that they had property of a particular value. One individual had some real estate, and real estate was considered land ownership, and that totaled for those 27 individuals $10,120. Now, comparing that to the white population, the top 10 highest value property holders I listed here, and also obviously they're all white and from various parts of the United States. L.B. Brooks, he listed his occupation as miner, but he was really also a contractor. He built, along with his partner Francis Clark, much of the Natoma main canal and also the North Fork ditch. So he was a contractor. We have a liquor merchant in there. A.P. Catlin, he listed his occupation as lawyer, no real estate, and property $15,000. A.P. Catlin in 1860 owned between 18 and 20% of the lots in Folsom. So that he did not list the real estate holdings, I'm not sure why. That's why, again, you have to take these valuations and what these men listed, with a big bag of salt. A.T. Aerosmith, civil engineer, I highlighted him because he engineered the Natoma ditch and many of its laterals throughout Granite Township, and in 1860 was president of the American River Water and Mining Company. So obviously a lot of money and wealth coming from water in 1860. The Chinese were obviously building some wealth, and they had the additional burden of the foreign miners tax. So that was an extraction of wealth from the Chinese, and it was estimated that that Chinese miners tax was about $1,200 per month for Sacramento County. So it was, now that just didn't come from Granite Township, that was the Chinese miners throughout Sacramento County, and that was primarily close to the Folsom area and south of Placer. Then sometimes you're typing along 2,000 entries into a spreadsheet and you come across the name and you go, that guy, Hartford Anderson. I remember him. Hartford Anderson was at the center of the Alder Creek Riots. He was able to incite approximately 150 miners, after a lot of whiskey had been poured, according to reports, to go and kick out the Chinese from the Alder Creek mining area. So him and some other gentlemen got this mob of people marched down to Alder Creek and scared the Chinese off. They tore up their sluices. They tore up and burned down their homes. They essentially terrorized them out of the area. And even the Sacramento Union, unlawful and barbarous treatment of the Chinese. Now, the Alder Creek area had many different water ditches through it that were owned by the Natoma Water and Mining Company, and that supplied the miners, and there were Chinese down there that was buying water. Hartford Anderson denied that he had anything to do with it, and he said, really, this all is about the Natoma Ditch Company. And, he said they were a monopoly, they were a soulless corporation, etc., etc. Now, this is a much larger issue, as we will see. But Amos Catlin, president of the Natoma Water and Mining Company, wrote a long letter to the Sacramento Union about the affair and some of the backstory to it. And he was outraged that this mob had inflicted violence on the Chinese community. So part of the backstory is that Amos Catlin in 1857 buys 9,600 acres of the Leidesdorff land grant. Okay, now land grants, Spanish and Mexican land grants, were private property, and that was kind of the only private property that was recognized initially when California came into the Union. And you can see from this image all of those blue lines. Well, those were all the water ditches of the Natoma Water and Mining Company that entered into the land grant. And Amos actually had to buy the land because the Folsom estate, Captain Joseph Libby Folsom, having died in 1855, was threatening to, levy rents on that water. So he bought the property for the Natoma Mining and Water Company to protect the mining ditches. And once he held the property, or the Natoma Company held the property, Amos was a lawyer, he started an ejectment lawsuit against people who were cutting down trees. Now, wood choppers, wood was a primary source of energy, and one of the men involved in cutting down the trees for extra money was Hartford Anderson. So he wasn't too pleased at the lawsuit levied against him by Amos Catlin to begin with. There was another issue. The Leidesdorff land grant was in dispute, even though there was a map from 1856 upon which people were buying land, including Amos Catlin. Now, Amos's purchase of that land grant did not include the town of Folsom or the Sacramento Valley Railroad. However, proponents of an alternate layout of the Leidesdorff land grant wanted the eastern boundary pulled west. And this is significant because the boundary they wanted would be essentially where Alder Creek went into the American River. So that meant a large portion of Amos's purchase of the land grant would return to federal public land. And if it was public land, you know, people could just kind of do what they wanted. The feds weren't around, so you could cut trees, mine, it was technically owned by the federal government, but what were they going to do? And I can see the argument being made by Hartford, Anderson, and others that the Leidesdorff land grant, as the map of 1856, is no good. It's in dispute. The Secretary of Interior has requested a new map be drawn, and this is public land. And the Chinese don't need to be here, and we should take it over and do with it what we will. There was also the feeling that the Natoma Water Company had a monopoly, and they did. You know, the mining was on dry ground, far away, oftentimes from the river. The miners needed that water to wash the earth to get to the placer gold. So the Natoma water canals were essential for mining in the area. And mining was, big. It was a large part of the economy. And Chinese miners were customers of the Natoma Water Mining Company. This is a sales report from the American River Water and Mining Company in 1858 of the Chinese miners that were buying water at Sailor's Bar, right down the river here in Sacramento County. So it was important. Now, Amos also outlined in his letter to the Sacramento Union some of the confusion about the water. He noted that there were some Chinese men who bought a mining claim from some white gentlemen, and that mining claim happened to be above some other white miners on the line. Now, even though the Chinese miners were using less water, they were buying less water, sometimes during the summer months, there just wasn't a lot of flow. And so miners at the end of the line didn't get as much water to wash their dry diggings as people higher up on the ditch line. So there was a feeling that somehow the Natoma Company was favoring the Chinese miners, when really it was just a hydraulics issue. There was just no way you could get enough water to the end because they didn't have enough water to begin with. And Amos was pretty upset at the hard language directed at his company and him, and that the facts had been distorted, because he was proud of his work at the Natoma Water and Mining Company. He started it in 1851, and he was out there, and he was very involved in the mining industry, and so he was wounded. You could tell from the letter he was wounded that the people thought somehow there was some sort of conspiracy against miners. And he said, "We treat them all the same. We have no partiality. We're going to sell water if we have it to anyone that comes along." This is an excerpt from one of the pages from the Granite Township. And yes, sometimes there was just page after page of Chinese, and their occupation was miner. In 1863, Amos Catlin goes back to Washington, D.C. and argues before the U.S. Supreme Court for the original Hayes survey of the Leidesdorff land grant. In 1864, the U.S. Supreme Court says, yes, the Hayes survey stands, and that alternate Mandeville survey with the eastern boundary pushed to Alder Creek on the west side, that went away. So Amos prevailed, and that kind of settled the issue. Now, there would still be conflict with the Chinese down the road. But over the next couple of years, things were kind of okay in Granite Township. I don't know if the population of Chinese decreased after the riots or if it increased after the U.S. Supreme Court said, you know, this is the way it's going to be. But it is an interesting part of history in the Folsom area that at least in 1860, you know, it was just people from all over the world working sometimes together, sometimes against one another to make this community of Folsom. And there were so many different industries, but obviously mining was a big important part of it, and the Chinese were a big important part of Granite Township in the 1860s. So for history here in Sacramento County, I'm Kevin Knaus.